welcome to the 15th episode of Reinventing School. I'm Howard Blumenthal, and today we are talking about student empowerment, which is sort of an easy phrase to throw out there and way more complicated than it seems, but that's part of what we'll get into. We're also going to see sort of the intersection of how schools have evolved or are evolving to meet that need and some of the pushback that results from that. So as I say, none of these issues that we're dealing with on Reinventing School are simple or one-sided, or everything is regional, everything is local. We have all sorts of different aspects of this. So these conversations tend to become more complicated than they seem at first. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really happy that we've gone through 15 of these and I still feel like I'm learning a whole lot. So with that, let's just grab onto that term student empowerment and talk about very briefly what that means. That'll give us an opportunity to kind of get to know everybody just briefly. So Julie, you're at the top of my screen, so we're going to start with you just because that's the way Zoom works sometimes. Tell us who you are and tell us what student empowerment is.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Julie Evans. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of an education nonprofit called Project Tomorrow. We're best well known for doing the annual Speak Up Research Project, where we collect the voices of students, teachers, parents, and administrators from all around the country, and then share those results to inform local decisions as well as national policy. You know, our work, Howard, since the very beginning has been about student empowerment. We started off with the idea that it was important to listen to students, but not just to listen, that's student voice. It's more important, at least from our perspective, that people have the opportunity to act on those voices. So how do we enable the voices and empower those voices to impact change? How do we bring agency to students so that they feel empowered with their own voice and their own actions to have a difference in their educational lives?
Okay,
so,
let me stop you there.
Yeah.
Michaela, you're a student. What student empowerment? Do you feel empowered? Does that term ever come up in your conversation?
So ever since the shutdown, I've been home doing virtual work. And since then, I have been much more calm and expressive with my work. And I've been learning what I want to learn, not what the teachers tell us to learn.
What do you mean by that? For example?
Like, I get to do project-based learning where I can take things apart and learn how they work.
And do you do that because you're curious or because that fits into to a teacher's plan for you?
Because I'm curious and I can pick what I want to learn.
So what have you picked? What have you learned in the last 2 weeks? What have you chosen to learn?
I've learned that about gardening and how different things take different times to grow and how things work with that.
Cool, thank you. Michelle, you're coming at this from a very different angle, and you've done some public speaking and made some noise as a result of your opinions about this. So give us a sense of who you are, and if you can, give us a sense of what student empowerment means in your world.
Yeah, absolutely. So the very short version is that I taught as a college professor for 15 years and was pretty frustrated with the way higher education works. Felt like it doesn't actually help students figure out who they are and what they want to do with their lives, and doesn't really start them doing it. So 5 years ago, I quit that career path and started my own college. And the way we approach, so we just graduated our 3rd cohort of students. We're about to bring in our 6th cohort of students next week. And we are doing it in person because we're a very small college and we are able to do that. We're grateful for that. And what we do is often categorized as a blend between structured and unstructured learning environment. So all of the students are in a cohort, they take core classes together, but everything is project-based. We have no tests or grades or textbooks. And then the other half of their curriculum is labs and workshops, internships, and they have a guide who they meet with every week for an hour to help them as Michaela was talking about, identify things they're interested in, things they want to learn, and then figure out how to do that in the context of the 2-year college program here.
All right, so I'm going to throw you the phrase student empowerment again in a sentence or two.
It's mostly asking them, what do you care about? What do you like? And providing a lot of guidance and support and opportunities to explore. So they make their own decisions about what projects they do, what they learn, how they integrate their passions, all of that. And we are mostly just the support structure to provide them opportunities to do that and introduce them to organizations and people in the community that they might not otherwise have access to or know about.
Cool.
They tell us, and then we do what they say, basically.
Helen, does it work that way in your school life where you just decide what you want to do, you tell them, and they make it happen? Does it work that way?
So my school experience is basically high school up to that point. And the most that like us as students have like decision wise is just like what classes we take, but we don't necessarily get to choose like within the class a lot of things. I mean, sometimes depending on the teacher, they'll ask like, would you rather do this or that? Like, but the curriculum is still always the same. And it's generally the same approach to how we learn it, and we don't get to decide that a lot of the time. So.
Good, thank you. Chris, you're probably the single person in my life who's taught me the most about schools being a more malleable idea than I had originally thought. So project-based learning, for example, is something that I learned about from you. You just sort of opened my eyes to the possibilities, and thank you for that. Can you explain, like, we met some time ago, so give us a sense of what some time ago looked like and how your views on empowerment have evolved, and explain to us who you are as well,
Sure.
although I suspect a lot of people will know.
No one should.
You're famous.
Hi, I'm Chris Lehmann. I am the founding principal and now CEO of the Science Leadership Academy Schools. We are a 3-school network inside the School District of Philadelphia. Everything we do is based on our 5 core values of inquiry, research, collaboration, presentation, reflection. It's my wife. And then the other big thing that powers us is the idea of the ethic of care, right? The idea that there's a huge difference between these 2 statements. I teach math, I teach my students math. Children should never be the indirect object of their own or the implied object of their own education. And for me, actually, I like agency even more, and this is a bit sort of an evolution of my thinking. I like agency rather than empowerment, because empowerment can still be, I am giving you your empowerment. It still assumes a sort of invisible paternalism in the way the word and the structure of the word. Agency, the idea that we can help every child unlock their own agency, to me speaks to the notion that every person has, that it's a right, like that agency is a right of every human. And our job is to help kids to access and unlock their agency. And for me, the idea really is that what it looks like is at the end of 4 years of our school, what I want every kid to feel and to really own is that we have helped them to become fully actualized, fully realized citizens of the world, ready to go out and thoughtfully be able to make change, whether that's in their personal lives, their local, their however they want to see that scope. Our job is to help them develop the skills necessary to be those essentially active participants in our world. And so what are all the skill sets that are needed there, right? How do you research? How do you ask big questions? How do you thoughtfully attack those questions? What are the artifacts you have to create to convince people of those things? And within anything we do, any class, right? Like it causes me pain when I hear, Helen say, oh, well, I get to choose these classes, but inside the classes, I kind of just have to do what the teacher tells me to do. And for me, work is negotiated space, right? Student work is negotiated space. And yes, there is always like, there's skill sets that are fundamental that you're learning. So I've got to do a thing so that way I can develop the skill and da-da-da-da-da-da. But then when we say, what does it mean to apply these skills to an enduring understanding or a big idea or something, there's got to be space for kids to be able to say, this is where this has meaning to me. This is where this actually matters to me. And this is the thing this is the big question I want to ask around this topic or idea or concept. And this is how I want to manifest my learning. And again, there's parameters and that's navigated and negotiated space. but student agency, part of student agency is the right to be able to say, yeah, I get that this is a thing, like, I've got to learn this stuff, and here's why, and it's clear that this matters to me. And you know what, I'm a filmmaker, I want to make a film when I do it. Or you know what, like I have a passion for programming, so I'm going to design a simulation. Or you know what, like I'm going to get with 3 people and we're going to write something that is a position paper that we're going to try to get published in the Inquirer, the Philadelphia, not the National. So like that notion that like students have a say in how they manifest those artifacts of learning. Students have a say in the way they take on an idea and the questions that they can ask, and that can be done collaboratively, and that there's a collective. It's not just this individualistic thing, but it's this collective notion of how do we attack these questions and problems together. That to me is like where we get into really powerful stuff. And that's how we help kids see and understand and own their agency that is their right as a human being.
So that right, I sort of felt, I'll go back to my high school, I expressed that right more than most students express that right. As you guys are beginning to get to know me, that probably isn't a surprise. When I became interested in something, that became the center of my world. And anything the teachers or the school system or whatever needed me to do, I would do, but it would be number 2 or 3 or 4 on the list. And eventually I'd get to it or not. And so far it hasn't made any difference. I'm getting old enough now where I can probably say that with some conviction. But it still doesn't work that way. And when I explain to people what I did in high school, public high school, nothing special, people look at me and go, "Gee, I wish I could do that." It's like, that's a long time ago. So it's like, yeah, we were doing this big theater production and I was learning so much and so was everybody else that we just blew off classes for 3 weeks so we could do rehearsals and make scenery and sell tickets and do all that. It was the most transformative experience of my life. And I became the guy who negotiated with the principal to spring 3-4 dozen students out of their normal routine. Now, I've been a producer. That's what producers do. I get that. But why is that still unusual, or is it unusual? And I may be naive about this. Michaela, in your environment, could you do that?
No. We had during theater productions and stuff like that, we had to stay on top of our work. We could not take off of work and just set up. We just had to do our work.
But when you're doing work as an adult, you say, you know what, this is really important. Everybody else is going to have to wait. I'm going to do this. I'm going to learn what I have to do. I'm going to push the thing out the door and go. But school isn't set up that way because it's preparing you for work. Julie, help. I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is, and maybe I'm going to take your conversation in a slightly different direction, Howard. But, I mean, for today's students, school is only one small part of their learning life. Let's be honest. It's an important part, but it's not the only part.
It takes a lot of time.
But comparatively to a 24/7 environment, it's a part of it. What we're seeing in our research is that the agency that Chris was talking about and the experience that kids have, they're doing that. They're doing it outside of school. They're doing it in self-directed learning. It's not teacher facilitated. It's not moderated by the school, but they're doing exactly those things. They're having those same type of experiences, Howard, that you had, but they're doing it outside of school because the school paradigms don't necessarily always allow for that type of flexibility or self-direction or the opportunity to have the experiences that students think are purposeful. And a lot of it has to do with purpose. And I heard a lot of purpose in what Chris was saying. And I've had the pleasure of visiting Chris's school, so I know about the role of purpose there. But kids are finding that purpose. I just wanted to make that point that, yeah, we're going to talk about reinventing school, which is really important. But let's keep a broader view on the learning experiences that students are having, because it's not just dictated from 8:30 to 2:30 anymore. The access that they have to these resources outside of school are plentiful, whether that's just in a smartphone or if they have some other type of connection.
Helen, how does this measure up with your life?
So I agree with what Julie said, like that kids are still finding ways to learn on their own and stuff like that. But I think school isn't necessarily just like a small part of our lives. It tends to be, at least as a high school student and someone who just went through junior year, it's a big part of it. Like it takes up, when we were actually going to school, it took like up to 7 hours a day of our day actually being at school. And then there's a lot more like doing homework and stuff like that. And so it's, I feel like, at least when I was back in school, everything revolved, like I had to work around school. And if I wanted to go learn something on my own, my first thought was, will I have time for this? Because school like restricted like the amount of flexibility I had, I guess, if that makes
Chris,
sense.
how do you provide Helen with the flexibility and the structure? I know you've certainly addressed this question in many ways.
Well, there's a lot of answers to that. I mean, number one, we do have to own that, like on some very basic level, one of the roles of school, and it should be done in a much more thoughtful way than it is done in most places, is that there is still a general body of knowledge that it makes sense for people to have access to and to understand, to be that fully realized citizen. Now, let's be honest, much of what we teach and the way we teach it in school disconnects that body of knowledge from actually being a fully realized citizen, right? I think the moment we are having as this society, as people are realizing that, for example, the way we teach history has left many voices out, right? And that all of a sudden, the work of, if you look at the work of Dr. Kendi and all of that, people are realizing there's a whole body of knowledge they were not taught in school. So let's start with, we should question that which we say must be taught. I think also, if you look at the moment we're in, we have to ask ourselves whether or not we are helping students understand the why, right? How many Americans sat through science classes and tuned out and are now at a place where they don't believe a mask is necessary, right? That is a failure. That is a pedagogical failure in this country, because we have schools that are disconnected from the why, from why it is important that there are things to teach. Now, that being said, the greatest limiting factor we have in school is time. To squeeze the world of knowledge into 4 years of high school is a Herculean task that no one can succeed in. So one of the things we've got to think about is, how is it that we help kids to develop that sense of agency and curiosity and understanding that the more we know, the better decisions we can make as a human, such that they want to keep learning for the rest of their lives and learning with purpose, right? Again, to go back to that idea. So how do you do it? There's lots of ways. Number one, you have, again, within classes that kids still have to take, because you still got to take science and history and all those things, you create the opportunity for kids to ask powerful questions. That's why that notion of project-based learning is wonderful and great, but inquiry-driven project-based learning is where the win is, right? Because then you're thinking about inputs and outputs. What are the big questions? Like, so if I'm introduced to a concept or an idea, the most important thing is not what you think I have to know about those ideas, but what are the powerful questions that I have when you present these ideas to me? And how are you going to help me as a student figure out how to answer those questions and figure out these things for myself and grapple with the myriad challenges and questions and complexities of our world? The other thing that we can do is we can create space in school for kids to actually have more agency over what they learn. So like, for example, at SLA, in the 9th grade, we bring in outside folks from our community to teach what we call mini courses, which are every Wednesday afternoon. There's a whole bunch of different courses that are beyond the scope of the traditional classroom that kids get the chance to like play around with for a 9-week cycle, whether that's botany or yoga or go to or modern art or nutrition and food science. Like, we've got all these crazy, we find wonderful folks to come in and teach cool stuff that you might not otherwise learn, just exposure. Then in 10th and 11th grade, we have our individualized learning plans, where every Wednesday afternoon you're going all over the city and you're doing internships, or you're volunteering, or and you've identified these things. Like, I'm really interested in bike repair, so we get you a job, we get you 2 weeks interning at or 2 hours a week interning at a bike repair shop. Or, I'm thinking about becoming a teacher. Great. We'll get you, 2 hours a week, you're going to go volunteer in a middle school and be a tutor in your classes. Oh, I'm really fascinated by politics. Great, we've got connections down at City Hall. Then senior year, we have the capstone project, which is a year-long inquiry project where we still provide that structure of like, here are the 5 core values, and here's some structure on like what an annotated bibliography is and how you do the research and da-da-da. But the topic is yours. What do you want to do? I want to build a car. Great, go build a car. Here's what we want you to do. How can we help? I want to write a novel. Great, go, like, how do we help, right? And so this idea that we are creating space and we're giving kids release time, right? So they have 2 hours, we're giving that Wednesday block. And so what we say to kids is, we know, because we're not ridiculous, we know that a lot of seniors don't use that Wednesday block to work on it. But what we're able to say to kids is, you have 80 hours of release time to do a project that is wholly of your own creation. It needs to look like 80 hours worth of work.
And that's terrific, but why can't I make it half?
What do you mean?
When you said before, well, you know, we have a point here where we're able to parse the time that kids spend in 9th grade, 10th, whatever it is, and you've given them really rich opportunities to experiment, learn, do it on their own, do it in small groups. That's all terrific. But I still have this bulk of stuff I've got to do that I'm not interested in doing, that no matter how hard we press on that inquiry basis or anything else, the fact is I'm still sitting there learning something I have absolutely no interest or inclination towards.
Because school serves 2 purposes, Howard.
Okay.
School serves the individual, but school serves society too.
So
right?
You want people to learn public health, but they don't learn public health.
Well, I think number one, we can do a better job of how we teach it.
Fair enough.
And the purpose of this, and again, you know, not everybody is going to love everything. That's okay. But you need to be exposed to it. And you need to have that opportunity to know why it's important. So if we were to create a student bill of rights, right after safe school, which after the year we've had was a really big issue.
Yes.
For those folks who don't know, our school was a construction site at the beginning of the year, and the district told us it was safe. It was not safe. We exposed the students to asbestos. We had to move out of the school. We were in 4 different buildings over the course of this year. So safe schools, real important. But right after the right to go to a school where I am safe, physically, emotionally, what have you. The next thing that every child has a right to ask and get a real answer on is, why do I need to know this, right? And the old answers of, this is good for you someday, or you might need this, don't fly. Think about the way we teach most subjects in high school. We teach to the 10% of the room that might major in the thing. And we don't ever ask ourselves why the other 90% need to know this, right? And the fact of the matter is that is a disservice. We should be, part of what we do is, if we say this body of knowledge is important, then we have to do a far better job of allowing kids the opportunity to see that and to engage with it in ways that aren't good for them someday, but that are clear and direct in why this helps them be a better citizen now. And we can do that. That is possible.
So what we're going to do, because you opened up, thank you for opening all of that up. Michaela, and then Helen, and then Julie, and then break. And then when we come back from break, Michelle, who's going to explain to us what happens on the other side of this once they graduate high school and the reinvention of college. So whatever order I did, let's go ahead and do it. I think it's Michaela first. Unmuted Michaela is better.
Yeah. So what was the question again?
Chris, ask her the question again, because you framed up so many things. What are you curious about?
I don't know what.
Do you think, that's fine, I lost it. There's too many things happening. I was hoping you knew. Do you feel as though the body of knowledge that is being pushed at you in high school, or hopefully you're pulling in, do you feel that most of that is presented well and interesting, not presented well? And do you feel as though you could just as soon do without it, even if it was presented in the best possible way? Or do you feel like, no, it's pretty much what I need to know? Just curious.
Well, I do need to know what they're teaching me and all, but the way they're just teaching it, they have us sit down for 45 minutes to an hour in a classroom, just taking in lectures and knowledge. and there's no time for project-based learning, which really helps me. So all the knowledge is necessary, but not in the way they're giving it to us.
Fair enough. Helen.
So I think as I was listening to Chris, I had a few thoughts. So I think a lot of the times people forget what the actual purpose of school is, and it's so that people can learn and develop themselves, but it's become such like a structured environment where you have to get this done. Like you have to take this many classes of each subject. And I know so many people, including myself, who just take classes for the AP credit or because they're a more challenging one because it'll end up helping you get into a different college. And it's always like, it's kind of become a competition where kids will take certain classes because it'll improve their chances of something else in the future without even thinking like, okay, I'm taking this class because I want to learn what they're teaching me. And I think that's something that should be talked about more, because it's important. Like you're still learning things, but it's for the wrong reason, I think.
Fair enough. Hey, boy, together again.
Yeah, so in addition to all the large scale research we do, I also have the wonderful pleasure of doing about 30 focus groups a year with students. And so it's so encouraging to hear Helen and Michaela talking. You know, I had a student tell me recently, you don't understand, Dr. Evans. High school is just a place I have to get through to get to a better place. So it underscores what Helen was just telling us, that for way too many kids, they don't understand the purpose of it. And it is just a stepping stone on the process. One of the things that we've seen is that actually when you get into conversations with students such as this, where we have the opportunity to say, well, if you design the ultimate school, what would it look like? What would be the characteristics? The students talk to us about 3 key factors. One, that it's socially based learning, where there's collaborative learning, peer-to-peer learning, that's really important. Where that learning is untethered. So it is not limited by what my teacher knows today or the resources in my school or even the limitations in my community. And then so that they are open to the world in terms of access. And the third is what Chris was talking about, that it's contextually relevant. Explain to me the why, explain to me the purpose, explain to me why this is important. So I always carry those 3 around with me when I talk with folks about either designing new schools or redesigning schools, or why isn't school meeting the expectations? It's because we're not addressing the type of student vision for learning that students really feel are important for their future.
I'm going to come back and ask all of you about agency in your own lives and whether or not you feel as though you have a sufficient amount of it. Right now, we're going to take a break. We'll come back to Michelle. So, Michelle, you've kind of taken this whole situation, having come through the traditional college setup, and went, this doesn't make sense. There's got to be a different way to do it. And then you did it, and you actually are now, you're graduating your 3rd group, right? So can you walk us through the lens of agency? What'd you do? Why'd you do it? And is it working? And I think we may be looking at a frozen Michelle. So we'll come back to that in a second. So talk about agency for a sec here. And this is actually, I'll start with Julie. Do you feel as though when you wake up in the morning or when you start your week, that you have a high degree of control, a fair amount of optimism, a fair amount of hope, and you work in an environment where you're doing that allows you to do what you want to do. And we want to add other elements to agency, but that's how I would probably define it. What's your agency quotient? Like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how agent are you?
I think probably just like most of us, every day is a little bit different. I'm running a nonprofit, and so there's lots of constraints on what agency I have. But I've been a huge proponent of agency, and so we've created it as part of our organizational culture to make sure that people have the opportunity, our staff, our team have the opportunity to direct their own activities around where they think things are most important. So I get invigorated by agency and my own agency.
Okay.
I obviously love experiences where I get to feel like I'm in control of driving the destiny of the research that we're doing, the work that we're doing, the engagements we're having with schools. So I would like to hope that I have high agency every day. That's
Okay.
not real, but I would say most days, sure.
Chris?
I mean, so again, it's interesting, right? Because there is it depends on how you define the word. One is I work for the School District of Philadelphia, which at times can be an incredibly constraining entity. And yet I'm also in the Innovation Network, and I've also had the opportunity to start 3 schools of my own. So obviously, like, on some level, I have a lot of agency. But there's this other thing that we've got to remember, right? And I'm sure Julie feels this as well, which is that agency doesn't just mean do what you want, right? And that's really, really important because, you know, leadership at its best, for example, is servant leadership. So my agency, one of the things that constricts my ability to just quote unquote do what I want is the need to do what I have to do, right? Now the question becomes is, do I have the power to make the decisions that allow me to serve my community, that allow me to be the change agent I want to be, understanding all of the constraints that come with collectivism, the notion of a sort of collectivist movement, right? Like, so agency isn't just can you do what you want. Agency is, do you have what you need? Do you have the abilities, the skills, the space to do to be the person you need to be in the world? Understanding that being that person you need to be in the world, there's a lot of constraints on that no matter where you are. I have, like, as Mr. Lehmann, I have a way I have to act, right? As principal, I can't walk in and like do whatever I want. That would be bad. Now, does that mean I don't have agency? No, I have tons of agency to be the person that school needs me to be. But that's where we have to understand that, like, again, and there's this sort of very, very American notion of individualism. And we've got to separate individualism from agency. They are not, there's, yeah.
That's a big idea. Michelle, and thanks for back, you plugged in your connection. I'm going to start with the agency question for you as well, because you've started your own thing. So in theory, you should have enjoyed a great deal of agency. And because you are more independent than not, agency should fill the room. Does it?
It does, yeah.
Oh, good.
And I think that helps a lot with providing that role model for our students, because as Julie was mentioning, I also have given and empowered my staff with lots of agency. They can do what they want. We have like a results only work environment. They do their work in the best way that they need to get it done. And I guess to Chris's point, where my agency is limited, I literally can basically do anything I want. And I have the resources and the skills and the things that I need to do it. Where I am limited is in what our students need, and also in my case, in what my faculty and my staff need. So sometimes I am limited in what I'm able to do individually because I am responsive to their needs as my top priority. It's still worth it every single day. And I think that it provides a really good learning environment for our students, because to one of the things we were talking about before of whether you can get that feeling in a traditional school, I think a lot of the barriers are, and it sounds like, Howard, you were able to overcome these yourself when you were in high school, it's in our minds. So sometimes we can unlearn some of the things that society has done to us and that the school system has done to us. And we can reach out as students who maybe perceive ourselves as the lowest power player in the situation. But in reality, if schools are even remotely doing what they should be doing and teachers are doing what they should be doing, students are first. Students have the most power. And we need to listen to them and we need to do what they are requesting. And so when I did teach in traditional settings, I would always encourage students who were in my classes to go talk to their faculty, form relationships with their teachers, and say, hey, I really am learning this stuff and I am thriving in this situation. I would really rather communicate my learning through making a documentary film instead of writing a paper, and do that negotiation and do that conversation. And more often than not, the teachers would respond positively to that. Not always, but even in just doing that, the students could unlearn some of the things that have been put on them and could gain agency for themselves and gain new sets of skills. So I find that here we spend a lot of time with our students initially helping them unlearn things.
So I had this sort of strange, Facebook actually, ran into somebody who I had hired many years ago, and she described my working style and my style as a boss and all that. And I was really young, and I was surprised at how much agency I had in a big company. We invented MTV, we invented Nickelodeon. We were able to do a lot of amazing stuff. And then my memory was that we didn't, like somehow that agency got taken away, or I didn't have the flexibility. So that led me to an interesting question. What happened, right? So I started asking people who I worked with at that time, do you remember, like, why was it that I was able to accomplish so much in that 9-month period? And then it seemed as though it was a hard stop. I didn't change. I was still a little, I was really at the beginning, I was astonished they gave me as much responsibility as they did. And so here's the answer. Number one, you seemed like you knew what you were doing. And so we let you do it. That was part of it. It was just like, I just did it. But the second was, there was executive chaos above me. And eventually that clouded the environment and limited everybody's ability to move. So it wasn't me, it was the environment. So part of the components, or some of the components are, you need a proper environment, or you need to create a proper environment or find one or whatever, in order to be able to have agency take hold in any way, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get anywhere. The second is, you have to have something between self-assurance and optimism that you are, that people, it's worth doing the work. People will listen to you, can get things done. Because if you keep getting shut down, and that's a big part of the education system, it's very difficult to cultivate agency. And the third is, you have to have hope, because you have to be able to see a horizon beyond the horizon that you're at now, because you need something to strive for. All of those tools and stuff and courses and textbooks seem to matter a lot less than those feelings that so many years later I still plug into and use all the time. So I don't know whether I'm in whether I'm the strange, person who just got lucky and had a funny path, but I don't think that was the case. I think everybody goes through this to some extent. So anybody jump in.
Well, and I think it's really important, Howard, that we name one other thing here, right? Which is, who gets those opportunities?
Yeah.
Right? We haven't talked about race. We haven't talked about gender. We haven't talked about class. We haven't talked about all of those very, very, very important structures that overlay our society right now and make decisions about who gets to do those things. And so part of what we have to deconstruct is, like, to your point around, the administration was chaos and therefore it restricted everyone's agency. If society also creates pathways where people, where depending on what race you are, what gender you are, what class you are born into, what opportunities you have the notion that you can have hope, that you can have agency, that it is your birthright. We have to do a better job also of saying, how do we create those conditions, not just for those who have traditionally had it in this country, but rather how do we level the playing field? How do we ensure that agency is not just the privilege of the few, but the right of all. And I think
Michelle,
that's a very important piece of this puzzle.
Thank you. Michelle, I think you're working pretty hard on this, right? So lay out how your work life is set up and what you're doing with other people and how you responded to traditional education and what you did instead, and what you've done instead.
Yeah, so initially we started out by making lots of, I guess what I would now categorize as small, easy changes. And a lot of it comes from and is inspired by the abolitionist teaching framework that Dr. Bettina Love advocates for. And I think we're seeing a lot of that happening right now. And there are, there's a wide range of abolishing schools. You can abolish schools altogether. You can abolish certain elements of them. You can adapt certain elements of them. So there's a wide range of things. And I would say that initially we started in what I guess I'd say the easier stuff. We don't have any grades. Okay, that was not so hard to do. We did everything project-based. We don't have any textbooks.
Let me just contextualize it. This is a 4-year college that you invented from scratch. Give us a little bit of that so we're all a little more clear.
Yeah, it is a 2-year college that we invented from scratch. And so our students at the end of 2 years, they have an Associates of Arts degree, which they can then use to transfer to a 4-year college if they want to, although we definitely challenge that the 4-year college is the only path to success. It is in most of our alumni situations, they don't need a 4-year degree to do what they want to do. They can just start doing it right away. So we strongly encourage them to do that if that's possible. And and I didn't think it needed 4 years to do what we're trying to do. So the degree they get at the end is self and society. Half of the curriculum is about self-knowledge and self-exploration and knowing who you are. And half of the curriculum is about society, what's going on in the world. And how do you combine those two to do your purpose-driven work in the world, figuring out, who you are and what the world needs and putting those together. So, so they do get a college degree at the end of it. Most of them don't care that much about that. It's more about the process. And most of our students have either tried a non-traditional learning environment before, homeschooling or unschooling or an alternative school, or they've gone to a traditional college and realized, oh, this is definitely not for me. And but they're curious and they want to learn and they want to be in community and they want to have collaboration, not competition. So all of those sorts of things.
Michelle, let me stop you for 1 second.
Yeah.
Helen, you talked about AP classes and a fairly traditional track. When you listen to Michelle, do you think that sounds just great, or that's not for me at all, or somewhere or some other field? Like, how do you filter what you're hearing from Michelle?
I like when you first said no grades, I was like, that sounds nice, but I don't really understand exactly like how that would work because I'm so used to everything being grades, everything being like letters and everything you do based off of numbers. And so without the grades, I'm just kind of like, for me, that's my way of just gauging how well I'm doing something. And I know that's probably not the best way to do it, but that's just what I'm used to. So I'm curious about the process and curious about like how that would work for me, because I do like the idea of everything being project-based and everything being like, if you get it done however way works for you, then that's great, you learned something. But I've just always been like in this headspace of I'm going to go to a 4-year college or whatever it is. And I think that's just because that's what I'm used to and that's what everyone else around me has done.
Yeah.
Michaela?
Yes.
What do same kind of question. When you listen to Michelle and she designs this very different way of thinking about what a college is, what the path is, what's most important, do you feel as though this is something that is foreign? Do you feel it's something that we ought to be doing as the normal idea? Do you think it's something that's only for some people? How do you feel about that?
I feel like what she's doing with project-based learning is what I need. and it would really make me feel like relaxed with school and things. But I agree with Helen with the grades. I need something to like base my work off of. Like, I want to see how well I'm doing.
Can you not evaluate that yourself? You know how well you're doing, don't you?
I mean, yes, but this is kind of bad, but it makes me like feel good seeing like an A. And if I have like a lower grade, seeing that makes me want to work harder to get the grade up.
You
Can
said
I
you're interested in
add some-
gardening, right? You
Yeah.
said you're interested in gardening. If the plant grows and the vegetable tastes good, don't you give yourself an A? Like, why do you need something from somebody else saying, well, no, because, I mean, I understand somebody saying, well, you know, you grew that in a weird way. You didn't use the right soil. You didn't put so the correction is helpful.
Yeah.
But why do you need somebody else to tell you that?
I don't. It's just I'm so used to it. It's going to be a hard transition.
Chris, why does she need somebody else to tell her that?
Well, I think number one, all of us as human beings operate on intrinsic and extrinsic motivators at various points in time, right? And we got to own that, right? Like, and grades have become the sort of standard extrinsic motivator and standard extrinsic measure. And the problem becomes like whether or not, like what that means, right? How do we help? Like, there's nothing wrong with, like, let's use her gardening. There is absolutely nothing wrong with Michaela working with a master gardener who's been doing it for longer than her and can help her get better faster and can give her feedback and say, oh, you know, yes, let's look at why this thing grew. What do you think you did? How could you do this better? Da, 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 da. And took on that mentoring role and gave her clear and helpful and useful feedback, or asked good questions that allowed her to have that next level of inquiry, that allowed her to go seek out the next level of answers. Those are essentially, that's feedback, that's grading. Now, the problem is in most schools, it becomes this toxic, horrible thing.
Right.
You know what I mean? So like the question becomes, how do we create the conditions by which we can learn from others and get assessed on where we are in our learning at any given moment in time? That in and of itself is not bad. Now, the thing we've got to break, and I will tell you, like, so we give grades at SLA because I have to get these kids from Philadelphia who have long been ignored by the higher ed system into college, right? And let's talk about, again, the systemic racism that exists in higher education and how kids that I serve don't get looked at the same way. And so I wasn't going to fight the battle of the transcript with these colleges. So we give grades. We do it in a way, we also give narrative report cards and lots of, formative feedback. And we try to a million other ways to not just turn it into the grade churn. But if you want to get rid of grades, you got to go after the colleges. Because until we do that, then you're putting it on every school that chooses not to do that to figure out how they're going to make sure that we're not revolutionaries at the expense of our children. And that's a huge problem, especially when you serve underserved communities.
And of course, there's this looming question, which we won't get to just yet, about, well, how do agency and grades kind of interact? But Julie, what do you make of this? You talk to an awful lot of people about this, I'm sure.
Yes, this is really fascinating. You know, when we talk to kids about doing project-based learning, for example, right? The kids will always say to me, and I don't know if this is the case for Michaela or Helen, or what Michelle has seen, is that they say our teachers are assessing us all wrong. They're doing it backwards. We shouldn't do a project and at the end get a grade. We should be assessed on the process. So how did we divide up the work? How did we decide someone was going to be in charge of creative and someone was going to be in charge of data analysis? How did we decide that? The learning is in the process, but we have all gotten so socialized, everyone, including our students and our parents and our educators, to think about final assessment, summative assessment, without really thinking of the formative component associated with it. It's really fascinating to me, Howard. We did a whole study last year. We looked at what kids were doing on YouTube. You know, kids have YouTube channels, they're running YouTube businesses, they're curating content, they're recommending content. It's an important part of their learning life. More kids told us they were learning the skills they need for the future through their interactions on YouTube than what they were learning in school.
Yeah. All right. So let me stop you there, because
Okay.
Michelle has developed this entire way of thinking about how people should work their way through the day and through to your education. Try to get specific for us. Tell us about a student. Tell us about a path through which they've picked up skills or picked up an understanding, and how they've developed agency along the way.
Yeah, sure. So, and I give a little bit of a preview of this in the TEDx talk, which you referenced at the very beginning about one of the things I've spoken about. One of the students who was in our second cohort had tried a traditional college and realized that that wasn't a good fit for them. So, and their interest was mainly in art and social justice and where those two things can intersect. And so found out about wayfinding, came here and spent the first couple of terms unlearning a lot of the things we're talking about, saying, oh, wait, if I don't get a grade, then how do I know this? And everything is, instead of a grade, they get, 2 pages of narrative evaluation that talks about strengths and improvements and all of this stuff. And then realize the value of forming relationships with every single faculty member and getting to know them all individually, and vice versa, letting the faculty get to know them so that they could have a real learning collaboration instead of a one-way relationship. And so at the very end of the first term, the student said, I want to host art shows. That's one of the things I want to do. And I'm going to try to host an art show on campus every term for all 6 terms that I'm here. And they ended up hosting, I think, 8 or 9 in the 2 years that they were here. And they got their internship at an art gallery downtown called the Ori Art Gallery, which also does LGBTQ rights, art, social justice, combines it all. They became the assistant curator at that art gallery as part of their internship. They now work for Wayfinding as a full-time member of our staff as our equity and inclusion specialist, and they still get the chance to do their art and work at the gallery. And all of our students build an online portfolio that shows the world what work they're capable of doing while they're with us. And their guide helps them choose what to put in that portfolio, what to show the world. So this student, TJ is their name, has this at the end of just 2 years, which what our students accomplish in 2 years is more than what most adults that I know accomplish in 10 years. So TJ has this entire website built of all of these art projects and all these art shows and videos they've made and various things that they've produced and created. And they can go out into the world and say, this is what I'm capable of doing. Here's my body of work. And they're working in exactly the intersection of the fields that they were interested in. And our job, back to what I said at the beginning, was just listening to them the whole time and saying, okay, what do you want to be doing? What connections are you missing? Oh, here, we can make this connection for you. We can introduce you to this person. Or how can we help you stretch into the next zone of what you're trying to do? So in TJ's case, they had never hosted an art show, but they'd made art. So we said, how can we provide, we'll provide the space. We provide some mentorship and event planning. So they were able to keep stretching and growing so that at the end of 2 years, they had this whole new set of confidence.
Michelle,
And so that's sort of what it looks like. It's different for every student, but that's an example of what it could look like.
Michelle and Chris, it sounds like you both read the same book at the beginning of this, right? It sounds like you both have come to very, very similar activities. So the obvious question is, are you the only 2 people who have read this book? And by the way, why isn't everybody reading this book? Because this seems to make so much sense. Or is it something you just can't scale? I mean, it just seems crazy to me that what you're doing, and Chris, you and I have known each other a while. I've watched you do this over and over and over and over again. So why is it that when I go into a school almost anywhere in the world, it doesn't work this way? This isn't new information. This isn't a revelation. The idea of student agency is something that we've been at for a long time. And, I'm happy to raise my hand and say, I did it. And then I talked to my father and he's like, yeah, I did it too. So the stories are really parallel about how he was able to ditch French class and end up getting a grade because he did the stage show for the French. He figured out the system. And I don't know, it was so much gaming the system. And this was a poor, underprivileged kid, right? This wasn't an advantaged kid. So somehow you develop the something, but can you do it over and over again? Or did we just kind of get lucky in the gene pool and the zip code pool and all those other pools? Help. How do you do this to make it work?
I feel like the reason it doesn't exist more is because of the societal structures that are in place that want to keep things the way that they are. And so it's all based on power structures and white supremacy and systems so that's why it's not more prevalent than it is. But I'm hopeful that that is changing now.
And
why aren't we protesting on the streets about this?
I think it's also hard. Let's be honest. This is hard. And it requires a very powerful mindset that is wrapped up in supremacy culture. It is wrapped up in those things, but it's wrapped up in control, right? Teachers, and think of all of, think of the world we're living in right now, where, we have this amazing moment where all of a sudden the most powerful tools for creation and agency and ownership, the laptops, the phones, all this stuff, show up. And what do? We use it to lock everything down. We use it to spy on people. We use it to restrict and to constrict. And that's a challenge, right? So all of a sudden we can measure kids better than we can, or we think we can. We can measure kids better than we ever can before. So let's just keep working to design the perfect test. So that way I can tell you everything a child has ever learned from me. What utter hubris, right? And what is it doing to schools? And what is it doing to the teachers and the kids? So why was this easier for you, Howard, and for your parent and for your father? Because we didn't have devices in our hands that allowed us to log in at every second and know exactly where every kid was. It was just easier to hide.
Yes, it was. And easier to play games with the system too. Michaela. Can't hear you.
It dawned on me earlier that when Chris was talking about the grades, that project-based learning and the need for recognition, ever since I was 9 years old, I've done something called Bundles of Love, where I chose to start a club at my school where we make survival bundles for the homeless, and we deliver them to the homeless people on the streets of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore City. And my school, truthfully, did let me have agency in the fact that I could do it at school, but I also couldn't do it when I wanted to and where. They set that part of it.
When you say my school let me have agency, it breaks my heart. My school let me have agency. How weird is that, right? Julie, you want to kind of start winding this up a bit, although heaven knows we could talk about this stuff endlessly, but what are your thoughts along the way here, particularly with regard to student empowerment, which is where we began?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that differentiates the work that Chris has done and the work that Michelle is doing is that they have been able to make adaptations to a highly structured process that have been outside the box. And unfortunately, in too many environments, people either don't have the resources or the wherewithal to be able to do that. And that flows downhill to in terms of limiting students' potential and limiting their sense of their own student agency, or limiting what they have as the audacity of hope. And so it is undeniably a power conversation that we're talking about. That's the part of empowerment. There's power in there. So who has the power? Who is giving the power? Who is taking the power? And who has responsibility for providing environments for students? And so unfortunately, schools and classrooms are one of the most power-driven environments that we have, and we come up through it as students, either with the opportunity to break outside of that or to learn how to be good school players. And that, I mean, I think that's part of this whole conversation that we've had over the past hour.
And to call out race issues and to call out white supremacy, and to all understand that there's going to be a lot of people who are watching this, some of whom may really strongly disagree, but we're free to at least have that part of the conversation. I guess that's progress. I don't know. Michaela, does it sound like progress to you?
It does, yes.
Okay, Helen?
Yeah, I would say it's progress. It's just not enough. Like, even if we're still working towards the right thing, we're still not there yet. And we have to keep that in mind. Like, yes, things are better, but that doesn't mean they're where they should be, I think.
Good for you. Michelle?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would add that it's important to talk about it, but it's also important to be doing things about it. So the talking about it is not enough.
Yeah. Chris, you want to wrap it up?
I think it was said, right? I mean, like, talking about it is great. We need to raise awareness. That's a huge piece of this puzzle, but the next steps have to be action oriented. The next steps have to be like continuing to work to make this better. It's just that simple.
It's tough. Fortunately, we at least have a forum now, and we're at least stopping for a moment to think about it. But there's so much more to do, including a really good definition of agency, which we don't quite have yet. We're all still discovering what that means. We can put pieces and parts together, but I think every kid should be able to say, I have agency and here's why. And I'm not sure we're anywhere near that point in the, in development yet. And yet when I hire people, I look to all the things you guys talked about. I'm not looking at grades. I'm looking at what they've accomplished and who they are and all that. So that's got to be central to the way we think about this. So with that, two housekeeping announcements. One, we had a very popular episode last week about pods and micro schools, and I encourage everybody to have a look at that if you haven't. Number two, next week we're going to be doing two episodes. One, responding to the Wall Street Journal article that appeared last Saturday about why we ought to open schools, from a think tank that has looked at a lot of data and has come to very, very strong conclusions about that. And then we follow that on Thursday. So we have a Wednesday and a Thursday next week, both at 4 o'clock Eastern time in the US. And that episode is about cyber attacks and just how vulnerable all of this notion of distance learning and all that turns out to be, because we're very reliant upon technology now. And the question is whether or not that's wise. So several things happening, all of this happening at one time, not far from opening the school year. Good luck with that. A lot of discussions about that as well. But thank you everybody for joining us. And we will see you next Wednesday and then next Thursday as well. So thank you, everybody. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.